I never thought it would happen. I mean, I've known Jack for years. He's always been Mom's husband. The guy who showed up at my high school graduation with a proud smile, who sat at family dinners and asked how my day was. Nothing more than that, and I was okay with it. We were never particularly close, but we got along well enough. He was a good man, kind to my mom, which was all that mattered. But things changed after I moved back in. It wasn't supposed to be for long, just until I found my footing again after that breakup. I wasn't ready to be on my own yet, and Mom had offered their guest room without a second thought. I figured it would be a temporary arrangement. Just a few months, I told myself, but a few months turned into longer than I expected, and suddenly I was spending more time around Jack than I ever had before. At first, it was nothing. Small things, really. He'd ask how my day was going, or we'd end up sitting at the kitchen table together late in the evening, talking about life. He was trying to be nice, I knew that, and I appreciated it. But then I started noticing little things, how he'd look at me a second longer than usual, or the way his voice would soften when we were alone. I didn't want to read too much into it. It was probably in my head. I'd been single for a while, and maybe I was just reading too much into the attention. That's what I kept telling myself. But then there were moments when the air between us felt heavier, like there was something unspoken, something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't intentional, at least I didn't think so, but it was there, and it made me feel something I wasn't ready to admit. One evening, Mom was out at a book club, and it was just Jack and me at home. We'd both been in the kitchen earlier, chatting about nothing in particular, and after a while we drifted into the living room. It wasn't the first time we'd been alone, but that night it felt different. The house was quiet in a way that made me nervous, the kind of quiet where every small sound seemed amplified. Jack sat on the couch across from me, flipping through his phone, and I tried to focus on the book I had in my lap, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After a while, Jack stood up and went to adjust the thermostat. I watched him, trying not to be too obvious, but something about his presence filled the room. It was subtle, the way he moved, but it was enough to make my heart race. I hated that I was noticing it. "Is it too warm in here for you?" he asked, turning to look at me, his hand still resting on the dial. I shook my head, quickly, maybe too quickly. "No, it's fine," I said, my voice coming out a little more breathless than I intended. "I'm comfortable." He lingered for a moment, his eyes holding mine longer than they should have, before he nodded and came back to sit down. The space between us suddenly felt smaller, though nothing had physically changed. We sat in silence for a while, the TV on in the background, but neither of us was paying attention. I could feel him watching me now and then, and every time I glanced up, he'd quickly look away. "I'm glad you're here," Jack said, breaking the silence. His voice was quieter, softer, like he was sharing a secret. I looked up, surprised by the tone of his voice. "Yeah," I replied, my own voice catching a little. "I'm glad I'm here too." He smiled, but there was something behind it that made me nervous. The tension between us was impossible to ignore now, and I could feel it pulling at me, even though I knew better. Jack wasn't just some guy I could flirt with and walk away from. He was my stepfather, my mother's husband. But sitting there, in the quiet of that living room, I couldn't deny the way I felt. Something was shifting between us, and I wasn't sure how to stop it. The days after that night felt strange. I found myself tiptoeing around the house, trying to avoid being alone with Jack, but at the same time, part of me was drawn to those moments. It was like walking a tightrope. I knew I was on dangerous ground, but the tension between us had only grown, and I didn't know how to handle it. Jack hadn't said or done anything since that evening, but there was an unspoken shift. He was always around, always watching, and I found myself hyper-aware of every glance, every small interaction. One afternoon, Mom had gone to visit a friend, and I was in the kitchen, scrolling through my phone trying to distract myself. I heard Jack come in from the garage, and I tensed up immediately, though I tried to act normal. He didn't say anything at first, just moved around the kitchen, cleaning up a few dishes, acting like everything was fine. But I could feel the energy between us, and I hated how much it affected me. "Hey," he said after a while, breaking the silence. "I've been meaning to ask if you want to join me for a walk sometime. I've been trying to get out more." I looked up at him, startled by the casual tone, but there was something behind his words that made my stomach flip. It was such an innocent question, but the way he asked it made me feel like there was something more, something unspoken. Yeah, sure," I replied, my voice a little shaky. "That sounds nice." His smile was warm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else lurking beneath it. "Great. How about now? It's a nice day out." I hesitated. I didn't know if it was a good idea to go, but saying no felt awkward, and maybe if we spent more time together in a casual way, I could get a handle on this weird tension between us. Maybe it would remind me that this was just Jack, my stepdad, and that whatever I was feeling was a fluke, something I could brush off. "Okay," I said finally, standing up from the table. "Let's go." We walked in silence at first, just a slow pace through the neighborhood. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I tried to focus on the warmth of the day, the birds chirping in the distance, anything to calm my nerves. But Jack was so close, his presence impossible to ignore. Every step felt like a step closer to something I couldn't quite define. After a while, Jack started talking about work, telling me about a project he was working on. His voice was calm, casual, and for a moment I let myself relax. This was normal. We were just walking, talking about everyday things. But then, without meaning to, I drifted closer to him, and I noticed his hand brush against mine. It was the lightest touch, barely there, but it sent a shock through me. Neither of us said anything, but the atmosphere shifted again. I could feel my heart pounding, and I knew Jack could sense it too. His pace slowed slightly, and he glanced at me, his expression unreadable. I swallowed hard, suddenly feeling nervous, unsure of what to do. My feet felt like they were moving on their own, but my mind was racing. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice full of concern. But there was something else too, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said quickly, too quickly. I could feel my cheeks flushing, and I hated how obvious I was being. This was wrong. It was all wrong. But I couldn't seem to pull myself away from it. We kept walking, our hands occasionally brushing together, each touch sending my mind spinning. I was hyper-aware of every movement, every breath, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the edge of something dangerous. Part of me wanted to turn around, to go home and pretend this wasn't happening. But another part of me, the part I wasn't proud of, wanted to see how far this would go. Eventually, we reached a small park, and Jack stopped walking. He turned to face me, and for a moment, we just stood there, the tension between us thick and heavy. I couldn't look him in the eye. I knew if I did, I'd see what was already swirling in my mind. Instead, I stared at the ground, my heart racing, unsure of what to say or do next. I've been thinking a lot lately, Jack said quietly, his voice almost hesitant. I looked up at him then, and the look on his face made my heart stop. There was something there, something I'd been trying to ignore but couldn't any longer. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but the words stuck in my throat. My mind was spinning, and I could feel the tension building again. threatening to spill over. My heart pounded in my chest as we stood there, facing each other in the park. Jack's words hung in the air between us, and I didn't know how to respond. I didn't even know what I wanted to say. My mind was a mess of emotions I couldn't quite sort through. I could see the same conflict in Jack's eyes, the same hesitation, the same pull. I was waiting for him to speak again, hoping he would say something to break the spell, to snap us both out of whatever this was. But instead he took a small step closer. I could feel the warmth of him now, just inches away, and it was like my brain short-circuited. My heart kept telling me to move away, to step back and end this before we crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But my body wasn't listening. I stood there, frozen, caught between the desire to flee and the undeniable pull that had been building between us for weeks. "Jack," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't even know what I was going to say. I wasn't sure I wanted to know, but he just shook his head slightly, like he knew what I was thinking, and he wasn't ready to let me finish. His hand reached out, his fingers brushing against my arm, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was such a simple touch, but it set off a cascade of feelings I didn't want to face. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He wasn't supposed to make me feel this way. "I don't know what this is," he said, his voice low and full of something I couldn't name. "But I can't stop thinking about it, about you." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. I couldn't look away from him now, even though I knew I should. I couldn't pretend anymore. The way he looked at me, it wasn't something I could ignore. It was something I'd been trying to avoid, to push down. But now it was right in front of me, and I didn't know how to deal with it. "I don't know what to say," I finally managed to get out. It was the truth. I didn't have the answers. I wasn't even sure what I was feeling anymore. But the way he was looking at me, the way he was standing so close, it made it hard to think straight. "You don't have to say anything," Jack said softly. His hand slid down my arm, his touch lingering, and it sent a shock of electricity through me. I could feel my body responding, even though my mind was screaming at me to stop. I couldn't deny that there was something between us, something we'd both been trying to ignore. But it was undeniable now. For a moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. The world around us faded, and it felt like we were the only two people in existence. His eyes searched mine, and I could see the same conflict I felt mirrored back at me. We were on the edge of something dangerous, something neither of us could take back, and then, as quickly as it had started, reality crashed back in. I stepped back, pulling away from him, the spell between us broken. My breath came in quick, shaky bursts as I forced myself to put distance between us. Jack's hand fell to his side, and I saw the flicker of regret in his eyes. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. We both stood there for a moment, the weight of what almost happened settling heavily between us. I can't do this," I finally said, my voice shaky. "We can't do this, it's not right." Jack nodded slowly, though I could see the conflict still warring within him. "You're right," he said quietly. "I know you're right." We stood there in silence, both of us trying to figure out what to do next. The tension hadn't disappeared. It still lingered thick and heavy, but we both knew it couldn't go any further. We had to stop before it was too late. "I think I should go home," I said, my voice barely steady. Jack nodded again, and this time he didn't try to stop me. Yeah, I think that's a good idea." I turned and started walking back toward the house, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I needed to get away from him, from the intensity of everything that had just happened. I needed to clear my head, to remind myself of who I was and what this would mean if we crossed that line. When I finally reached the house, I slipped inside and closed the door behind me, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. My heart was still racing, my mind spinning. I couldn't believe how close we had come to something that would have changed everything. And yet, despite the guilt, despite the fear, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about him. Since you enjoyed this video, click on the subscribe button on the screen and check out our channel for more videos like this.